Chapter 15. Luke chapter 15, a familiar section of Scripture to us for a lot of reasons, and probably Jesus' most famous set of parables, the lost coin, the lost sheep, and the lost son. Maybe you have seen the new docuseries, or at least the recent docuseries about Jeffrey Dahmer. That was released not too terribly long ago, and even though it was over 20 years that all of those court proceedings happened about the events that surrounded the murders that were done by Jeffrey Dahmer, still so many people are intrigued by his story and by the things that happened about him. But that one week in 1991 in Milwaukee, when Jeffrey Dahmer was actually being convicted for the crimes that he had committed, it was in the courtroom where it seemed like everyone in the nation was locked in on it. I mean, I wasn't alive, but if I was, I guess I probably would have been locked in on it like everyone else. And even some years later, I'm still interested in the events that happened that day. But in Milwaukee, the court was proceeding. Jeffrey Dahmer was in there. He was being tried. And hopefully everyone was hoping that he would be convicted for those crimes. And he entered a plea that day. And everyone in the court was shocked that he was going to enter a plea. And so they read the sentences, they read the charges, and Jeffrey Dahmer still says, I want to proceed with this plea. And so they ask him, well, what is your plea going to be? And he says, well, I plead non-guilty on the basis of insanity. And everyone was just thrown off by the fact that he would even say that. In other words, he says, I did it because I am actually crazy. I wasn't in my right mind when I did those wrong things. And so it wasn't actually me that was doing wrong. It was just because of the fact that I was crazy. Now, most everyone agrees that that's not necessarily true. Or they might even say of him, yeah, he is insane. It takes an insane person to do the things that he did. I think he was convicted for 15, even later, 16 of the 17 young men that he killed. That's like 697 years in prison, I think, is what he took on if he takes 15 life terms, which is what he was convicted of. He was going to spend the rest of his life in prison, even if he lived 15 more lives. Even his lawyer would say that he was guilty. But still, some people, they wonder, why would he do something like that? Was he really insane? Was he really insane? That's what I read an article not too terribly long ago as the docuseries came out. And that was the looming question in the documentary. Was Jeffrey Dahmer really insane? And it really didn't surprise me that the guy would write at length about trying to figure out whether or not Jeffrey Dahmer was insane. And it reminded me a lot of our culture and our country and the people that we surround ourselves with. And it was like, it just kind of conjured up in my mind this idea that people would really be okay with what happened if it were in fact proven that he was insane. And I think that's born out of the fact that we're really good at trying to justify why what we have done isn't wrong. Like we don't want to be a people that are guilty of doing wrong. And so we make up excuses and we make up these shadows that we like to hide behind to justify why what we have done wasn't wrong. It's like if they could agree that Jeffrey Dahmer was insane, it was somehow, some way in his mind convinced that it wasn't really him that did wrong. There was no ownership for what Jeffrey Dahmer had done. I don't know if he was insane or not, but I was just surprised by that was the plea that he entered, so that he somehow could escape the consequences of the wrong things that he had done by conjuring up that excuse. And I listened to that article, I read that article, and I thought about how similar the way that we live our lives and deal with wrong really is. That we'll dream up these excuses and reasons where we don't have to face the consequences of what we've done, because it's really, really hard for us to admit that we've done wrong. I read a book not too terribly long ago called There's a Lot More to Health Than Not Being Sick. It's a guy named Bruce Larson that writes, and it's about some psychological things, and these two doctors that he surveys, can't pronounce their names, so I won't even try, but he surveys these doctors and the studies that they had done about the psychological effects of our justice system and people who are in prison, and this was spurred along as a result of this Dahmer situation, and I read it after reading that article, and their conclusion about prisoners who were sent to them, those two doctors, for treatment was this. They said, we are not effective in changing criminals because we refuse to allow criminals to be wrong. He says, instead of allowing them to face their bad deeds and take responsibility, we are lenient and sentimental because we think people who commit crimes must be ill in some way. We refuse to believe that anyone in his right mind would repeatedly rob or steal or embezzle or cheat or murder. And the guy who wrote the article about this book, which is why I wanted to read it after this, he says, did you get the impact of that last statement? We refuse to believe that anyone in his right mind would repeatedly rob or steal or embezzle or cheat or murder. I believe the verb that he used in that last phrase in his book, Mr. Larson did, about the conclusions of those two doctors was chosen very carefully, that we refuse to believe that as a nation, as a people, as a culture, it is easier for us to excuse misbehavior than it is to punish wrongdoing. That was the conclusion of their thoughts, that it was easier for us to excuse bad behavior than it was for us to punish wrongdoing. After that study that those two doctors had done, they continued to build on their thoughts, and they believed that if you treat a criminal, someone who's a proven and tried criminal, there are things that they have done wrong, they've been convicted, everyone agrees that what they did is wrong. If you treat that person as someone who has consciously chosen to break the law, then most of the times those are the people that actually end up changing. That if you treat them as if someone who has actually done something wrong, then they might be inclined to change. But if you treat them as if they are ill, or if they are insane, or if they have all these things that are wrong in their life, then they'll hardly ever be held responsible for what they've done wrong. Those two doctors believe that if you, in the latter case, if you treat them as if nothing was wrong because they were ill or they were crazy or insane, there is no therapy, no advice, no counsel that you can give them that will give them hope of lasting change. Now, I said all that to say this. My thoughts tonight and our study tonight in Luke 15, it's not about Jeffrey Dahmer and it's not about the justice system. It's not about any of that. But the point I wanted to bring up was that it's tremendously difficult for any of us to accept and admit when we've done wrong. That we will go to great lengths to try to get away from ever having to say that we've done wrong, that we'll make excuses and we'll just try to hide behind things and avoid it altogether. And even though we live in a society that encourages us to make excuses and have all of these things right, most of us don't even need any encouragement. We're born knowing how to do that. In fact, the world, the Bible, it started knowing how to do that. You remember in the Garden of Eden when Adam was faced with the consequences of their sin. He first says, well, it was the woman, and then he goes so far as to say, it was the woman that you put here. Not just it was her fault, but God, it's also your fault that we did this because you're the one that put the woman in the garden. And so there's this natural response, this mechanism in us that triggers us to make excuses and to shirk responsibility when it comes to admitting that we're wrong. And so it goes, the first people ever introduced in the scriptures, it came natural to them to pass the buck. The Bible, I believe, starts by telling us something pretty significant about us, that it's our nature to deny blame, to shift the blame on other people, and to get away from the guilt of things that we've done wrong. In all the thousands of years since Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, nothing has really changed. It's in our spiritual bloodstream to try not to admit that we're wrong. I was thinking about this the other day, too. How I heard about a situation, and I guess the more I thought about it, the more I realized how much this phrase is in my vocabulary. Vocabulary. What in the world? Vocabulary. I was mixing two thoughts together. There are a lot of occasions where I might observe something that's clearly wrong. And it's so hard for us to say that something is wrong that we might even say something like, that's not right. And I say that a lot. I see something that's clearly wrong, and I'll say, that's not right. Well, I could say, and maybe I should say, that's wrong, but we don't like that word so much that we just try not to use it at all. That's not right. It's wrong. If it's wrong, it's wrong. And sometimes we just try so hard to not use that word. It's like it shouldn't be a part of our vocabulary. And sometimes we do it so subtly, we don't even realize we're doing it. Here's another one. I told Heidi I was going to say this tonight. I'd been thinking about it a lot because it's a bad habit of mine. And I'm going to pick on my mother-in-law because she's here for a second. And I didn't tell her I was going to talk about her, but she's here, so I'm going to talk about her for a second. Imagine Heidi and I are having an argument about something, and we're arguing and we're arguing, and I finally get to a point where I say, all I said was, your mom's coming to town again? And by me saying all I said was, it gives off this idea that I'm loving and I'm right and I've thought about it and you hadn't. That you aren't really thinking through this situation clearly. And that's a bad habit of mine. I do that. All I said was, and I realized the more I thought through it, that those are some pretty destructive words. It implies that I'm logical and I'm thinking about the situation, and then that person isn't. And what I'm usually saying is, it's not my fault. I'm not wrong. I'm right. You are wrong. And it's so hard on all areas of the spectrum to admit that we're wrong. As long as I live my life without taking the blame, without taking responsibility for the things that I've done wrong, it's always going to be fragmented and difficult and hard to ever have healing and to become whole. And so tonight I want to revisit a familiar passage to see how healing and to see how a feeling of being whole and forgiveness and good, happy lives were restored because someone was willing to say that they were wrong. Look at Luke 15. Back up in verse number 11. Jesus says, a man had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of the estate I've coming to me. So he distributed the assets to them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered together all he had and traveled to a distant country where he squandered the estate in foolish living. After he had spent everything, a severe famine struck that country and he had nothing, so he went to work for one of the citizens of the country who sent him into the fields to feed pigs. He longed to eat his fill from the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one would give him anything. And so when he came to his senses, verse 17, he said, how many of my father's hired workers are eating more food than I am? And here I am hungry. I'll go to my father's house and say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and in your sight, and I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired workers. So he got up and went to his father, but while his son was still a long way in the distance, his father saw him and was filled with compassion, ran, threw his arms around his neck and kissed him. And the son said to him, this is key, verse 21, Father, I have sinned. I've sinned against heaven and I've sinned in your sight. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. So you have this guy, a familiar story, with the urge to leave his father's house, to go and to live however he wants to live, to do whatever he wants to do, and ultimately see where that ended up for him. He ends up realizing that he is so much worse off by doing what he wanted to do than if he had just done what his father asked him to do. If he would have just reaped the benefits of being in his father's house, no matter how difficult or boring or weird it might have been to stay there for that time for this young guy who really wanted to do other things, he could have reaped the benefits of staying in his father's house. And he leaves and he realizes, man, I've messed up. I've done wrong. When he's sitting in a pig pen eating pig food, while even the worst of the servants, the bottom of the food chain essentially at his father's house, has more than enough food to be filled. And here he is in a miserable situation. And it's at that moment where like that light bulb in his brain goes off and he's thinking, man, I wish I would have just stayed there. It's my own stupidity. It's my own fault that I'm in this situation altogether. He can't blame his father. He can't even blame his critical older brother, his hypocritical older brother. No longer at that moment would he pretend to be something he's not. No longer does he want other stuff. He just wants to go home to his father. And there's only one way to do that. And that reality hits him like a ton of bricks, I'm sure. I'm sure it does because I know what it feels like when you have to admit you're wrong. I know what it feels like when I have to admit I'm wrong. That reality hits us so hard and it's so difficult that his father's servants were eating everything they wanted and he's eating pig food. And his thought was, I'm going to go home. I'm going to go home and tell my dad, I'm sorry. Dad, I've done wrong. Dad, I've sinned. I've not only sinned against you, but I've sinned against heaven, and I know I don't deserve what you're going to give me, but I'm coming home anyway, and I'm ready to accept that I've done wrong. And with that, the young man goes home. He brushes himself off. He meets his father in the middle of the road. They have a moment of forgiveness and grace and compassion that was only spurred along by that guy's willingness to say, I have done wrong. Now, I guess this is different probably than any other of the lessons that I normally like to preach, but I just want to bring our thoughts to a close with one observation. I think about Jeffrey Dahmer's situation and how after all of that bad stuff he had done, probably conscious, even his lawyer said that he was guilty. Everybody agrees that Jeffrey Dahmer's guilty, and he tries to shirk the responsibility of the consequences by saying, I'm insane. There's an excuse. Those two doctors have done extensive researches into our criminal justice system and seen how criminals were treated, and the ones that were treated as if they were ill or insane, well, they never changed. They stayed the same. But the ones who actually had to accept that they had done wrong, there was hope for their future. And we see a culture, a society that doesn't want to do that. They want excuses. But here's a man who shows us that if we're willing to accept the consequences that come our way because we're wrong, and admitting that we're wrong and the blessings that come as a result of that, you have this parable, the story of the one we call the prodigal son, who turned his whole life around by saying 3 words, I have sinned, or maybe in common vernacular, I am wrong. I'm wrong. His whole life was turned around by saying, I'm wrong. Now, here's the cool thing to me about this whole part of the story. When the young man says, I was wrong, or I have sinned, he said it while he was still living with the pigs. He said it while he was still far away from home. He said it even knowing that his father might not take him back, that his brothers might not take him back, that he might be looked upon with shame and disgrace from other people in his father's hometown. But he knew, I'm broke and I'm hungry and I'm ready to go home, and the only way that's possible is if I turn my life around. How can it happen? If I'm willing to admit that I have done wrong. I believe that Luke 15 and verse 21, just those 3 words, I have sinned, is quite literally a parable of my life and of yours. That I've sinned. And that you've sinned, I'm sure. That's because we're human and it's our nature. We are so ashamed to find ourselves in the pig pen that we won't even say that we're there. We don't want anyone to know that we're wrong. We don't want anyone to know that we're dealing with sin. We don't want anyone to know that we have struggles in our life. So we try to clean ourselves up. And we try to put on a good face, and we try to act like everything's okay, but then when we walk into church and we walk into our workplaces and we walk into those conversations with people, there's still pig food under our fingernails. It's like they just know, man. People just know that you're dealing with sin. They know that you're dealing with stuff. You can try all you want to hide it. I can try all I want to hide it, but people still know. Everybody knows when you've been living with the pigs. Tonight, this encouragement, thought, opinion, whatever you want to call it, it's for any one of you who feels like you're tired of living with pigs, feels like you're tired of being weighed down by something that you've done wrong, something that you have struggled with, something that you've just had a really hard time of learning how or figuring out how to deal with, and you're ready to be free from its weight. You're ready to be free from its grip and the pressure that it puts on your life. If you're ready to go home, then I've got good news for you. The Father is standing in the road waiting for you with open arms. He's standing there ready to take whatever you've done wrong and make it all right again, to love you and to care for you and to treat you with compassion. He knows where you've been. He knows how dirty and how filthy it was while you were there, but it doesn't matter to him at all. What matters to him most of all, more importantly than anything else, is that you come home. It's possible. It's possible, but it depends on one thing. You got to do what the prodigal son did. You got to be willing to say, I have sinned, I've done wrong. I've done wrong and I've sinned. That brings me back to the basic problem. The basic problem that we addressed in a few different ways, but the basic problem you can see even on the pages of Genesis 3 with Adam and Eve. The fact that we will not deal with our sin. In fact, we do 2 things when we sin. We hide most of the time, or we blame someone else. We try to escape its reality by hiding and acting like it didn't happen, or we shift the blame on someone else. And most of us are pretty good at it. We know a lot of excuses that get us out of having to deal with our sin, or we know just the right people that might even take the fall for us, that they don't even care if we shift the blame on them. And many of us have all those excuses memorized and in our pocket ready to use them. As long as you live that way, you won't be forgiven. You never will. You'll never experience the forgiveness of God if you live that way. Your refusal to give up your own mistakes, to address your own mistakes, it will cost you dearly. It means also that you'll live with the burden of carrying your past sins like a millstone around your neck. It'll weigh you down. It'll make you tired. And it'll make you miserable. You can't enjoy the forgiveness of Jesus if you live like that. It's possible to be forgiven through Jesus. That's the good news of the gospel that we talked about this morning. The beauty of the gospel of Jesus Christ. But Jesus won't forgive somebody who refuses to ask for forgiveness. I was wrong. It's hard to say. It's hard to deal with. It's hard to address when we have it in our own lives. But I want to ask you a question, maybe to gauge your spirituality at the beginning of 2024, and maybe by the time we revisit this at the end of 2024, we can ask ourselves, and maybe even answer it with all assurance and conviction that it is actually true. Is it becoming easier for you in your spiritual life to say, I was wrong? If it's not, maybe this is a good place to start, to do what the prodigal son did and say, God, Father, I have sinned. I'm wrong. I'm tired of living like this, and I'm ready to come home. Maybe you're asking yourself, is it easier to say I'm wrong? And maybe it is for you, and you've achieved some level of spiritual maturity, and you're on your way toward God-like greatness. Help other people see the beauty of admitting that they're wrong. Help other people see the value of admitting they're wrong. And let's together be strengthened in God and His forgiveness by being willing to say those three really, really, really hard words. Most of you who are older than me probably remember that show Happy Days. You remember the show Happy Days? There was a character on Happy Days named Fonzie, and she never could say I was wrong, could she? Right? I was Fonzie, I'm sorry. Fonzie was a he. I have my mind mixed up. Never could say, well, I was wrong, Philip, I'm sorry. I can say that. But you know, they never could say I was wrong on the show. From what I remember, it was always I was never could get the word out, right? And someone would always pipe up and say, I was not right. That's what they would always say. They never could say I was wrong. No one could. It's hard. It's hard to say I was wrong. Maybe tonight that's what you need to do. I was wrong, and you're ready to come home to God. Maybe you need to respond to heaven's invitation tonight for whatever reason, to obey the gospel, just to get something off your chest, or even to get yourself back on the right path. You can do that while together we stand and as we sing.